northeast of the United States. Anishinaabe people, their home is, if you might think about the eastern seaboard and the St. Lawrence Seaway, in and around that area. And it took Anishinaabe people about 800 years to get here. And when they got here by the thousands. By the thousands. And they found neighbors. And they found a land that was quite beautiful, much as it is today, in some sections that are unspoiled. And at that particular time, there was a unanimity in understanding lands, and how it was dealt with, and who moved in what area to another area. And the lines of belonging were very fluid. And when Europeans came, and by this I mean there were explorations before Columbus, but certainly after that, Europeans came with a different way of looking at land and a way of looking at resources. And that informs the issues that are in front of us today. And that's why I like doing these kinds of programs at colleges and universities. Because I'm a lecturer at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. When it comes to issues like this, we usually have a semester to unpack what's happening, or several semesters for interested students. But we don't have that kind of time. We have a very short time together. And I'm going to try and do my best to frame this question of what's happening around water with you as best I can. I was born in Neobit, Wisconsin. I trace my ancestry back to 6 different tribes, one of them being Menominee. My father was half Menominee and half Oneida. My mother filled in all the other ones. And I grew up here in the state of Wisconsin, quite proud of it. And growing up here, both Menominee Reservation in the summers, in the cities, was an interesting experience. And college wasn't anything I thought that was possible or anything that I even knew existed. But I was having an education, a higher degree of education as a young person, and I didn't even know it. Because as I made my way through college and now lecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, there's things that are never covered in textbooks. And how could they be with over 10,000 years of history? So to understand an issue is to understand the very origin of it. And these particular gatherings that we do, we have 3 components. One is the science, and that's usually handled by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Geddes. He's a retired emeritus professor, and he goes through the properties and how sulfide mining works. I've been present at his lectures. I've heard from other scientists, from conservation groups on the subject, because I've been on the tour for a bit now. And it's really quite fascinating to me, the story of mining. Dr. Geddes usually opens his talks by talking about mining in world history, and he likes to point to Rome, where there were mining practices, much that we use today, the same that's proposed for the reason why we're gathered today. And he said those mines that are in Rome, such, and as the way that it's practiced, is producing sulfide or sulfuric mine waste today. He says that when a mine in the scope and the nature that goes in and was proposed for the Menominee River, that those kinds of mines have been in operation for quite a long time. And up until about 3 weeks ago, Wisconsin had a prove it first law. And that prove it first law was such that if a mining interest that wanted to come into the state of Wisconsin and mine, that they would have to show for about the period of 10 years of operating a mine area safely, extraction of the materials that they're looking for, disposition of the materials and waste that's produced from that. Then after closing of the mine, to have it 10 years after that it operates safely without essentially having poisons and things that environmentally can create dead zones in communities. So when that law was passed for the state of Wisconsin, no mining interests have had any interest in mining in Wisconsin because no mining interest could produce the record of a safe mine. But now that's different. What's in front of the governor, our governor of the state of Wisconsin's desk, is now that our state senate and assembly passed a resolution to end that mining regulation, and that once signed by the governor's desk, then those mines can begin to operate in the state of Wisconsin. What's interesting about that particular piece is that's at the state level. If those of you who are from areas of political science here at the university, you might understand the term, all politics is local. You've heard that saying. And certainly that's where these mining interests and these mining pieces are going to go now, is to the local level, to the local municipalities, to the small towns that they are going to be involved, that are going to be involved in this kind of thing. And it's going to be kind of in your hands. Before it was kind of generally understood, the direction of mining. That would have to prove itself to be safe, to operate while it's in operation safely, and at the conclusion of its operation, then to begin to show, and all the way through to the end of the decade, that whatever residual was left behind was safe too. But that's not how it is. So now it's going to be up to the local municipalities once the governor signs the bill. So we'll see how that goes. And one of those places where certainly a test case is happening right now for our Great Lakes is going to be the Menominee River. And I have one of my favorite teachers, when he would look at a problem, would always say, if you want to know what a problem has within it, contained within it, and the questions for us and the challenges for us, go to the beginning. Go to the origin of those conversations and where the controversy is. Go to the very origin of it, and you will understand why these kinds of things are happening. And for us as Native people, now remember, I can only speak to you as an individual. English name is Mark Denny, from Muskego, Wisconsin. I can't represent the entirety of the Menominee Nation. I can't represent the breadth and scope of all American Indians that live in the United States or Canada. But I can represent myself. And I can represent my clan, and I can represent my family. Because I have those privileges and those authorities given to me within our medicine laws. So that I can represent, and that's what I'm representing today. When I open by telling you, Wayno Buju in the Wimmagana, that's hello to all of my relatives. Now this is what I mean by going to the origin of understanding something. Even in my own greeting of saying hello to all that is, all that was, all that ever will be, in words that include each and every one of you in this room, and all of the folks that surround us outside of this building, from the water to the earth to the trees, to those little insects that are burrowing their way into the earth and to the birds. That greeting to all that is, all that was, all that ever will be, all that are in this room, and all of those things that are all around us in this moment. And then the rest of it is that I speak to you as relatives. You know, to understand, where does that come from? And as I went on through my introduction, I go to my name, the name I was given within the same medicine lodge that I'm talking about, Three Fires Medicine Lodge. And then I went into my clan. which is the Sturgeon clan. And that Sturgeon clan traces itself back before people were here. And we talk about those times when we talk about these things in my clan. So when I talk about going to the beginning and origins of things, I don't just mean the conversation of the mining issue that's in front of us now. My particular moment in speaking to you is talking about the culture that surrounds each and every one of us, and the culture that surrounds me. When Menominee people, and we have some that are in the room tonight, talk about the origin of all people, of Menominee people in particular, that origin story itself, the very beginning, the fundamental beginning of people in this world, begins at the Menominee River. There is a specific place and moment in history when people were created. Within the culture of Menominee people, a story is talked about that a great silvery bear with a copper tail emerged from the earth. And as that being emerged from the earth and began a journey down that same river, it became a person, a human being. It was a male being. And as that male being walked upon this earth, other creatures joined that person in the journey. And the animals that first stepped forward, and they themselves becoming people, those became the principal clans of Menominee Nation. Menominee people. By and large, when you go to Menominee Nation now today, you'll see about 80% Catholic, thereabouts. There are traditional communities and ideas that are in and around Menominee. And these ideas live within all of them. So when I talk about going to the origin, I really mean going to the origin. What we're talking about tonight is a huge mine that's over 400 acres in total spatial area on the surface of our earth. And it's going to go down into the earth. If you can imagine, if ever you've been fortunate or privileged enough to see the Statue of Liberty, imagine 3 of those going into the earth. And that is the mark that's going to be on this world from this mine. The mining permit itself is going to go out for 8 years, but there's another 8 years add on to it that's not being talked about and needs to be talked about. And I always say this at all these mining presentations, is if anybody from Aquila, please stand up and represent what's happening instead of just taking notes and filming us. That would be awesome and appreciated, because we know you're out there, and we want you to be a part of this talking tour. And if maybe you don't have permission from your boss to do it, go back to your boss and tell them they're asking us to be a part of this mining tour. You don't have permission to talk yourself. 8 years after the operation of this mine opens on the Menominee River, they will be digging underneath the Menominee River itself. Underneath the Menominee River itself, creating tons of waste, looking for gold, looking for iron, looking for heavy metals. And the process under the way this is done is the trees and the earth herself is cleared out. The rocks are brought up from the earth. And all of those rocks are put together and then they're put into machines. And this site will be the place where they do the processing looking for heavy metals. Water's involved in all of this. Tons upon tons of rock crushed into things like that eventually become like baby powder. And if there's any veterans in the room, you're going to know what I'm talking about right now, because you've seen it. Maybe you've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. You remember the engineers from Boeing telling us, oh hey, that dust will never get into the engines, into the turbines, into the Black Hawk helicopter engines. That's not never gonna get in there. It always did. That's why the Army's always looking for engineers. That's why the Army, SEALs, whatever you want, Navy, whatever you want to talk about, whenever we go in those areas, are always looking for people who can do construction and engine building and repairs. Because when you get into environments where you have rock that's been pulverized into a talcum-like substance, imagine where that goes in the air, laced with heavy metals, and its effect on all the people that live in the area. Now, the state of Wisconsin itself, the state, our legislatures and our senators, those who are in favor of mining and for jobs, as they talk about a mine that they point as being successful. And that's right on the border of the Lac du Flambeau Reservation. A lot of Native people in the room know where that is. Some of you may not, but this helps add to your papers and to your searches of what happens. It's the same kind of mining. The difference with this kind of mine, it was very much on a smaller scale. The promise of jobs of coming into that particular area of our state of Wisconsin, those figures were just as bright. And that mine has now been closed. So what are the results of one of the best operating mines in the state of Wisconsin? As people like to point at that mine as saying, look how successful they were. This mine in Menominee River, within 150 feet of the banks of the Menominee River, that can be as successful as the other mine. Imagine what happens. So when I look at it, and you can look at the figures yourself, think about your generation. Your generation that right now on social media has a movement called Me Too. I don't know if anybody's heard of that. Involved in Me Too. Anybody hear of that here? Any hands? Maybe a lot of you, most of you have not. So for those of you that are not in social media and college students not aware of a movement called Me Too, it's a movement where women, it's very gender specific at the moment, are talking about an unequal power base in America and how that power base deals with them, especially when it comes to areas of abuse at the workplace, sexual abuse, either private or publicly, sort of how it's a man's world kind of thing. And women will stand up and say things like, that happened to me too. Some guy tried to forcefully kiss me. Some guy forcefully tried to grab me in my private parts, or did. And then what women are doing in this Me Too movement is on media saying, that happened to me too, with just 2 words, Me Too. So that's what I'm talking about. In the era of Me Too, we neglect to talk about what happens in mining towns in areas of pipeline where there's land camps, and we neglect to talk about the sorts of crimes that go up where these sites are established. In the era of Me Too, we need to remember that the town I come from, of Waukesha in Milwaukee, is number 3 in the United States in human trafficking. And it's not because we're using that area, that particular area, for people to be human trafficked and put to service in the communities. We're pass-through sites. We're pass-through sites where people are taking these timeouts. And where are these people headed that are being trafficked? These young women, these young men. They're going to areas like sites like mines, like man camps. You're not going to see articles of it. You're seeing the beginning of conversations about it. But wherever these sites set up, you can begin to see crimes around human trafficking begin to spike. So when we talk about mining, it's more than just about mining. It's also about the quality of life and what we do to each other. You won't hear from other places about this particular issue. But you'll hear it here. And there's a reason for it. Because when we talk about mining, we have to talk about the entire piece. As you yourself sit there and consider this idea of mining, you can imagine that you were in a space that my ancestors were in years ago, just after contact, during that contact period, certainly in going into a reservation area. For those of you students that are here, my ancestors same the very same question you have in front of you today. If I could use this floor as an example, I'll look at this floor and maybe I can look at this as my ancestors once did and look at it as it would be an entirety of a territory. And those territorial boundaries were fluid. Sometimes they could change at the result of a lacrosse game. But sometimes they could change as a result of population growth or diminishment, or populations moving in and out. But those boundaries were fluid. But when Europeans came in, the fluidity of those boundaries began to change in the favor of European constructs. The European construct of it is this way. And Benjamin Franklin was a huge fan of this, where what you would do is take a piece of land and make a grid system over that land once you have it mapped out. And once you have that land graphed out, then you can become to do this. This little piece here belongs to you. This little piece up there belongs to you. This little piece over here belongs to you. This little piece belongs to you. And all of those little pieces get parceled up into private ownership. And once we have that private ownership, then we can have the commodification of the land. This is what our teachers were talking about when they were saying, if you want to understand where a problem comes from, go to the origin. Where does this idea come from of the commodification, of the privatization of land? It's as close as dominant culture's creation story. Now, once again, understand where I come from. The Medewan Lodge. Medewan means way of the heart. Way of the heart. Menominee had this, and it was called Wet'suwet'en. Now I'm getting at the origin of things. So when we think about Native people and our original understanding of land base and how it was used, how it was parceled out, to understand my way of thinking, you have to go to this kind of, if I just could make a simple territorial area, let's say. And in some of this area, one village would be here, or here, or here, or here. And within 20, 30 years, sometimes more, sometimes less, villages could move freely within the territory of that area. So when within there, those Menominees that are in attendance, you'll recognize this, because the majority of your friends are either Eagle Clan or Bear Clan. I would challenge you to find a different clan. But when people talk about that Bear Clan, they talk about how the Bear Clan would go out, and they would be the soldiers and the protectors of a village, saying this is that area. And here in the state of Wisconsin, for just about and virtually every village, there was an area that was being protected. And that area that was being protected was the area of healers. I just got through doing a conversation about the importance of runners from one area to another. Oftentimes, healers were involved in that. That in one particular village, it would need a healer for this malady or that malady. But the bears were protecting that village, and in the very different levels of protection, in the middle of the village, Wet'suwet'en, or Medewans, the way of the heart. And that is where I'm speaking to you from this particular area. When Menominees talk about the origin of people, there's a story that actually is more than just the beginning of a single person, of that bear. The story includes there's a time before the person himself was created. And the bear emerged from the earth, meaning that all of this had been created. And as this bear was walking down the river, the earth was revealing herself to the bear. Revealing herself to that human being in new ways, in new constructs. Now when we think about the origin, think about how that story works for that spirit being, and where that spirit being is learning about the earth from the earth herself. And then let's compare that to dominant culture. Within the Mandela Lodge, we talk about this thing about how all creation stories are true. And it's an amazing teaching. If you can suspend yourself from thinking that one religion is true and one religion is right, if you can accept that all religions are true, meaning that this person has that truth and that's important to them, that opens you up for a lot of different understandings. So if we go to the origin of the story, we can begin to understand fundamentally, as Menominee people look at how this mind is coming together, we have a responsibility to that place, one, as a holy place, as an origin place. Has anybody here in their lifetime ever heard about Jerusalem being the #1 place for an open pit mine? Has anybody heard of Jerusalem being opened up to widespread anthropologists and archaeologists gathering together and taking Jerusalem apart one block at a time and going 3 Statue of Liberties into the earth of that holy place? For Menominee, this is what we're talking about. There is no designation for Native people in that place as an origin place of all people. For some particular reason in this country, Native people and the origin story of Native people is irrelevant. And imagine Menominee people whose creation story has a beginning before the beginning, as every one of the tribes in the state of Wisconsin has right now. When we think about that person going to the earth, and the earth is revealing herself to this person, how different that is from dominant culture. In Genesis, in the Old Testament of the Bible, where many major denominations and major religious groups will hold sway to that text of the Old Testament, what happens in Genesis? Who is created first? That's right. It's a guy. It's a man. And within the story of that very beginning, the man, as he walks through the earth, does what around himself? He names everything. So if I'm that guy, you're Jennifer, you're William, you're Takesha, you're Beverly. Let's see, you can be Desi, you can be Henry. Up there, you can be Kathy. Maybe up there, we'll call you Steve, right? Keep it to the whatever testament time we're living in now. Imagine when I walk in this room and I name each and every one of you. Each and every one of you that has your own origin story and your own place of being. And that when you were born, the very first thing that happened when you were born, the announcement of your birth was what? What came before your body came into this world? Water. When you were an infant inside of your mother, what were you in? Fluids and water. Over 70% of your body is water. And as a man walked through the earth in this Genesis, he would name all of these things. And then where do women come from? The same one. It comes out of that man's body. It's a very deep and very important and sacred story to dominant culture. I'm not here to dissuade you from a belief in that story. If that's your origin story, that's your origin story. But understand that in our origin stories are the beginnings of us not seeing the world in the very same way. As Native people would have these origin stories, we begin to understand the world like this. That this earth actually is our mother, could be our grandmother. The blood of the earth is the water. The flesh of the earth is the land. The bones of the earth are the rocks. Imagine when someone actually grows up with that, believes that kind of thing, and now here's the story of mining. Let me crush the bones of your mother in front of you. Tell you what, got an opioid epidemic right now. To understand this and to put not too fine of a point on it, let me take a needle, fill it with heroin, have your mom put her arm out, and what we're going to do is we're going to take that needle and we're going to push that under her skin, and we're going to take that needle and we're going to leave that in there, underneath her riverways, underneath her veins, underneath her legs, underneath her flesh. And that same person that puts that heroin needle into your mom, trust me, it'll be fine. And when you think about it, and you understand in history that the mining that we're talking about, going back to the times of Rome itself, still pollutes the earth and creates dead zones, and there's been no improvement over that kind of thing, and that same kind of mining exists today. So that person will tell you, let me put this vein inside of your mouth. Let me put this needle underneath that vein, sorry. And then I'll leave it there, and you can trust me. It'll be just fine. That sort of reasoning and that sort of thinking for Native people that have these kinds of beliefs and understandings of the world. That is why Native people are on the front lines of this particular moment. And I can say why Medeawans are on the front lines of this moment too, just as a spiritual piece. In the year 2003, the Grand Chief of Medeawan people, Three Fires, his name was Edward Benton Benet, Grand Chief of the Three Fires, the largest Medeawan society in Canada and America, in front of hundreds of people, said this. Maybe some of you were there. He said, one day, an ounce of gold is going to be as much as an ounce of water. So everybody started thinking about that. And he said, the water herself is under attack.